A judgment without merit. It was a bright and brisk Tuesday morning in the heart of the city when Melanie Carter entered the courtroom. The sound of her heels clicking against the marble floor echoed throughout the sterile, unforgiving space. The room, lined with dark wood paneling and filled with rows of uncomfortable benches, seemed more like a cavern than a place where justice was supposed to be served. But for Melanie, this was a familiar place, too familiar. She had spent many hours here before, but never in this position. Today, she wasn't there to argue a case for someone else. Today, she wasn't the one in charge of guiding the truth to the surface. Today, Melanie Carter, a federal prosecutor, was the one on trial. And what brought her to this moment was a simple traffic stop that, under normal circumstances, should have been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. As Melanie sat in the defendant's chair, her heart pounded, not because she feared the outcome, but because she knew how the system worked. She had worked within it for years, prosecuting cases involving civil rights violations, police misconduct, and institutional injustice. But for the first time in her life, Melanie felt the oppressive weight of being on the other side of that system. She was about to face the very bias that she had fought against for so long, and she knew it wasn't going to be easy. The events that had led to this day were simple on the surface. A police officer had pulled Melanie over on a quiet street just outside her neighborhood for what he claimed was a traffic violation, running a stop sign. At least, that was the officer's version of the story. Melanie knew better. She had been driving for years, and she knew her rights. But it wasn't just about the ticket. It was about the way the officer had treated her, the way he had spoken to her, the assumptions he had made the moment he saw her behind the wheel. The officer had followed her for several blocks before activating his lights, and during the entire interaction, he had been condescending, dismissive, and downright hostile. As soon as he approached her window, his first words were, "You people think you can do whatever you want," followed by a slew of other derogatory comments. Melanie had managed to stay calm and collected, as she had learned to do countless times before, but inside, she was boiling. Now, here she was, facing a judge who she could already tell would not look at her with the same fairness she would have afforded to someone else. Judge Clarence Wills, a man in his late 50s, had been known for his no-nonsense approach to court cases, but also for his clear biases. His reputation preceded him, and it wasn't a good one. As Melanie stepped into the courtroom, she couldn't help but notice the judge's gaze. It wasn't the neutral look of someone who was ready to hear a case, it was the sharp, scrutinizing look of someone who had already made up his mind about her. Judge Wills glanced up from the papers in front of him, his eyes lingering on Melanie for just a moment too long. Then, as if dismissing her presence, he cleared his throat and waved his hand in the air. "Call the next case," he muttered, his voice cold and detached. The bailiff glanced up and nodded, immediately announcing Melanie's name. The moment the judge heard it, his lips curled into a faint but unmistakable smirk. The judgment in his eyes was clear. He hadn't even heard the charges yet, but he had already decided what kind of person Melanie was, and in his eyes, it was a negative judgment. He was already assigning her value based on his preconceived notions. Melanie stood up slowly, her back straight and her posture poised. She knew that to maintain her dignity in this courtroom, she had to project confidence, even in the face of blatant bias. She approached the stand with the same quiet authority that had made her one of the most respected prosecutors in her department, but she couldn't ignore the way Judge Wills looked at her, like she didn't belong there. She wasn't the defendant in his mind, she was just another stereotype. The moment Melanie spoke, she knew it would be an uphill battle. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady, "I am here today to contest a traffic ticket that I believe was issued unfairly." Judge Wills didn't even look up from his papers. "Save us all the theatrics, ma'am," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "I've seen plenty like you come through here before. Just pay the fine and let's not waste the court's time." Melanie's blood boiled at the remark, but she held her tongue. She had been taught to never react impulsively in a courtroom, to always be in control of her emotions. But it wasn't easy. The disrespect hung in the air like a thick fog, and for a moment, Melanie couldn't help but wonder. How often had others before her been dismissed with the same callous indifference simply because they didn't fit the judge's narrow view of what a person should look like? Her heart pounded as she prepared to speak again, knowing full well that this wasn't just about the ticket. This was about a much larger issue, the systemic racism and biases that ran deep within the very institutions she worked to uphold. But Melanie was no stranger to this fight. She had fought these battles for years, not only in the courtroom but in her personal life as well. And now, she was about to take a stand, against the system, and against a man who had already decided her fate before she even had a chance to speak. She gathered herself, standing tall and speaking with the clarity that had defined her career. "Your Honor," she said, her voice calm but firm, "I would like to present evidence that shows this ticket was issued based on an assumption, not on facts. I have footage of the entire interaction with the officer who pulled me over. It shows that I was tailgate for several blocks before being stopped, and that the officer's behavior was inappropriate from the moment he approached my vehicle." Judge Wills let out a heavy sigh and leaned back in his chair, clearly uninterested in hearing more. "Evidence from you? Fine. Let's hear it," he muttered, his voice dripping with condescension. Melanie pulled out her phone, tapping the screen to pull up the video she had recorded during the traffic stop. She played the footage, and the room fell silent as the judge, the clerk, and everyone else in the courtroom watched the video unfold. The officer's words rang out clearly in the quiet room, "You people think you can do whatever you want." Melanie's heart sank as she watched the officer's hostile tone on full display, but she knew the truth had to come out. The courtroom was still, as everyone processed the implications of what they had just heard. The officer's prejudices were undeniable, but even then, Judge Wills seemed uninterested. "That's irrelevant," he said dismissively. "You still broke the law." Melanie's jaw tightened, but she refused to back down. With all the composure she could muster, she responded, "With all due respect, Your Honor, I didn't break the law. And I find it troubling that you refuse to even consider the evidence before you." The judge's face reddened. "Watch your tone, young lady," he spat. "This is my courtroom. I won't be lectured by someone like you." The word stung. Someone like you. Melanie had heard those words before, but today, they felt heavier than ever. She could feel the sting of a lifetime of microaggressions, the constant assumptions, and the weight of systemic bias. How many others had been dismissed in the same way? How many others had been told they didn't belong, or that their voices didn't matter? How many had been silenced before they even had a chance to speak? In that moment, something inside Melanie shifted. She wasn't just going to let this slide. She wasn't going to walk away from this. She would stand her ground. "Your Honor," she said, taking a step forward, "allow me to introduce myself properly. My name is Melanie Carter. I am a federal prosecutor with the Department of Justice, specializing in civil rights cases and police misconduct." The room fell into stunned silence. The clerk's pen dropped to the floor with a soft clatter. Even the judge, for the first time in the proceedings, looked up at her, wide-eyed and visibly shaken. "I'm sorry, you're what?" Judge Wills stammered, his tone no longer dismissive but filled with confusion. "I'm a federal prosecutor," Melanie said again, her voice unwavering. "And I specialize in cases involving police misconduct. And as for this officer, I've already filed a report with the DOJ's Civil Rights Division. I will be pursuing a formal complaint regarding his conduct and discriminatory actions." The room was now electric with tension. The judge's expression faltered, and for the first time, he seemed to realize the full weight of what had just transpired. Melanie wasn't just a woman trying to contest a minor traffic ticket. She was someone who had the power to change the system from within. She had the power to hold people accountable, not just for breaking the law, but for perpetuating it. The courtroom, once cold and sterile, now felt alive with the possibility of change. And Melanie Carter was at the heart of it all. The power of the unseen. The silence in the courtroom after Melanie's revelation was profound. For a few long moments, it felt as if time itself had frozen. Judge Clarence Wills, whose reputation was built on an air of unshakable authority, now appeared momentarily paralyzed. He blinked, clearly struggling to process the shift in power dynamics. Just moments ago, he had dismissed Melanie as just another young lady who had been pulled over by a cop with a bad attitude. But now, in the span of a few sentences, the entire narrative had changed. She wasn't the subject of his derision, she was the embodiment of justice. The courtroom had already been tense, but now it crackled with an energy no one expected. The clerk, a woman in her early 40s with a tightly pulled bun and glasses perched precariously on the edge of her nose, stared wide-eyed at Melanie. She had been an employee of the court for over a decade, and in all that time, she had never witnessed such an abrupt shift in the balance of power. Melanie's declaration felt like a punch to the gut of the status quo. Federal Prosecutor, Judge Wills repeated, his voice softer now, as though testing the words in his mouth to ensure they were real. Specializing in civil rights, no less. Melanie didn't flinch. She didn't need to. She had long known how to present herself in the courtroom, not just as a professional, but as someone with a clear, unwavering purpose. For years, she had defended the rights of marginalized communities, challenging corruption and misconduct in places where it was often invisible to those in power. The stakes had never been higher, and she was more than prepared to face them head-on. "Yes, Your Honor," she responded, her voice calm but forceful. "I handle cases involving police misconduct, as well as discriminatory practices that violate basic civil rights. And I am deeply concerned by what I've experienced here today." A wave of murmurs passed through the courtroom. The bailiff, a young man with a fresh haircut and sharp suit, shifted nervously from foot to foot. He had been quietly observing the scene since the beginning, but now he seemed unsure of how to proceed. The tension in the room was palpable. For once, it seemed like everyone, except the judge, knew the true weight of Melanie's words. Judge Wills blinked, his confusion giving way to something else, resentment, perhaps, or a deep sense of unease. He looked down at the paperwork in front of him, flipping through the pages with an air of distraction. The game had changed, and he knew it. The assumptions he had made about this case, about Melanie's worth, had suddenly crumbled under the weight of her expertise and authority. "Well, if you're a federal prosecutor," he muttered, still visibly flustered, "why didn't you say so sooner? This could have been handled differently." The implication in his voice, however, was unmistakable. It wasn't about the law, or about the facts of the case. It was about his perception of who deserved to be respected in his courtroom. Melanie had been right all along to recognize his bias. Judge Wills wasn't concerned with justice or fairness. He was concerned with who fit his narrow view of what a respectable person looked like in his courtroom. Melanie didn't give him the satisfaction of a response. Instead, she stepped forward, asserting her presence with quiet confidence. "I understand, Your Honor, that this may have caught you off guard. But I am here because I believe the officer's actions were not just unwarranted, they were discriminatory. I've already reported him to the DOJ's Civil Rights Division, and I will be filing a formal complaint regarding his behavior and the way he approached this traffic stop." Judge Wills, still rattled, glanced at the clerk who, after a beat, finally found her voice. I'll make a note of it," she said hesitantly, her fingers tapping nervously at her notepad. The atmosphere in the courtroom had completely shifted. What had started as a routine traffic violation had now become the setting for a larger conversation about systemic racism, bias, and the power dynamics at play in places where the public trusted their rights would be protected. The case had escalated beyond the ticket, it had become a matter of principle. Melanie could see it in the faces of the people in the gallery. Some looked stunned, others confused, but there were a few who shared her silent determination. For every person who had ever been dismissed in courtrooms like this one, for every individual who had been treated unfairly simply because of their race, Melanie's fight was their fight too. Judge Wills, for all his years on the bench, had never been confronted with someone like Melanie Carter. As a man who had carved out his career by using his authority as a shield against scrutiny, he was not accustomed to being challenged, especially not in front of an audience. Now, every word he spoke seemed to carry the weight of his desperation to maintain control over a situation that was rapidly slipping away from him. "Well," he grumbled after a long pause, "you may have your concerns, but let's not forget, there's still the matter of the violation itself. Regardless of what your qualifications may be, the law still applies." Melanie did not back down. Her response was measured, yet forceful. "The law is not a tool for perpetuating bias, Your Honor. The officer's actions were not about enforcing the law, they were about exercising prejudice. And I refuse to allow this court to overlook that." She paused, looking directly at the judge, her gaze unwavering. "Furthermore, Your Honor, I'm requesting a review of your handling of this case. I believe the way you have treated me, and the assumptions you've made about me, goes beyond negligence. It's reflective of a pattern of bias that should be addressed, not just for my sake, but for everyone who walks through this courtroom." The room fell into an eerie silence again. Everyone knew the gravity of what Melanie was saying. The stakes had never been so high, not just for her, but for the very integrity of the legal system itself. For a moment, it felt as if the room held its collective breath, awaiting the judge's next move. The judge, still reeling, seemed unsure of how to respond. His eyes darted nervously across his desk, the weight of his own defensiveness slowly settling in. But Melanie could see the cracks in his facade. The bluster, the arrogance, everything that had once defined him as a powerful figure in this room, was quickly unraveling. Melanie's hand clenched slightly, her fingertips brushing against the hard surface of the stand as she held her ground. "I know this isn't easy for you, Your Honor. But I'm asking you to look beyond your assumptions, your prejudices, and to do what is right. This court exists to uphold justice, not to reinforce the systems of oppression that have long held certain people down." Judge Wills took a long, deliberate breath, his lips trembling as he finally acknowledged the depth of the situation. "I'll review the case," he muttered, his voice tight. "And I'll certainly take your comments into consideration." But Melanie wasn't satisfied. Not yet. She knew this moment wasn't just about winning the case, it was about winning the larger fight, about proving that change was possible, even in the most entrenched institutions. She wasn't going to let this moment slip by without pushing for true accountability. "As for the officer," she added, "I'll be reporting him to the department as well. The community deserves better than this." Judge Wills sat back in his chair, clearly defeated. His authority had been challenged, and for the first time in his career, he wasn't sure if he had the strength to reassert it. But as Melanie turned and left the courtroom that day, her heart was lighter than it had been in years. She had stood tall, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been unjustly judged, dismissed, or harmed by the very institutions that were supposed to protect them. In that moment, Melanie Carter knew that the fight for justice wasn't just about winning individual cases. It was about making sure every person who walked through those courtroom doors felt seen, heard, and treated with the respect they deserved, no matter their race, their gender, or their background. And if she had to confront the system head-on to make that happen, she was ready. The battle had only just begun. Unmasking the truth. The courthouse doors swung open, and the fresh, crisp air of the city seemed to welcome Melanie as she stepped outside. Her heart had slowed its rapid pace, and her thoughts were no longer consumed by the tension of the courtroom. Instead, she felt the weight of her words, of what had just transpired, settling around her like a heavy cloak. The fight was far from over, but for the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel a glimmer of satisfaction. It wasn't the satisfaction of having won the case. In fact, the outcome was still far from certain. What had happened today, what she had revealed, was just the beginning. It was about something much bigger than a traffic violation or even a biased judge. It was about exposing the systems that allowed people to be treated differently based solely on their skin color, their background, and the assumptions made about them before they even opened their mouths. And today, she had cracked the door wide open. Melanie knew the road ahead would be long and filled with resistance. She could already feel the quiet murmurs of those who hadn't agreed with her approach, those who saw her as just another angry black woman challenging the status quo. It was a label she had worn before, and it never lost its sting. But today, something felt different. The ground had shifted beneath her, and the voices of the oppressed had gained a powerful ally. As she walked down the courthouse steps, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, recognizing the number immediately. It was her colleague, Jessica, who worked with her at the Department of Justice. "Melanie, are you okay?" Jessica's voice crackled through the line, a mix of concern and urgency. "We heard about what happened in court. You handled it, well, like a pro. But are you all right?" Melanie smiled, grateful for Jessica's concern. Jessica had been with her from the beginning of her career, and the two shared a bond forged through years of fighting for justice. "I'm fine, Jess," Melanie replied, glancing around the bustling street as she made her way toward her car. "But this case is far from over. The judge, he wasn't just biased, Jessica. He was complicit in perpetuating the system. And that's not something I can let slide." Jessica paused for a moment, processing her words. "I know," she said finally. "We've already got a team putting together a report on what went down today. The DOJ is going to take this seriously. You're not alone in this, Melanie. We've got your back." Melanie's heart warmed at her friend's words. In a world that often made her feel isolated, this kind of support meant everything. "Thanks, Jess," Melanie said softly. "I'm going to need all the support I can get. And we're going to need to make sure we hold that judge accountable. Not just for what happened today, but for every other person who's come through his courtroom." "I agree," Jessica said, her tone resolute. "We've got a plan in motion. Just make sure you stay safe, all right? The last thing we need is for you to become a target." Melanie laughed, but it was a hollow sound. She knew that there would be those who wouldn't take kindly to her exposing the flaws in the system, especially when those flaws hit so close to home. "I'll be fine, Jess," she assured her. "I've dealt with worse. But I'll need you to keep me posted on any updates. We can't afford to let this slide." After hanging up, Melanie took a deep breath and sat in her car, her hands gripping the steering wheel as she prepared for what would undoubtedly be a turbulent few weeks. She thought about the judge again, how quickly he had dismissed her, how his bias had clouded his judgment. But she also thought about how he had recoiled when she revealed who she was. In that moment, he realized he wasn't just dealing with any regular citizen, he was facing someone who had the authority to upend the very system he had helped maintain for years. Melanie had not just challenged the judge's authority, she had questioned the very fabric of the justice system that allowed people like him to operate unchecked. And that, more than anything, was what terrified him. It was the realization that the world he had constructed, a world where the powerful could walk over the powerless, was crumbling. Her thoughts shifted back to the officer who had issued her the ticket. The video she had played in court, the video of the officer making racist comments, was damning, to say the least. It wasn't just about her. It was about every black person who had been pulled over under similar circumstances, every person who had been subjected to biased policing and treated like a criminal because of the color of their skin. As much as she hated to admit it, this wasn't just about one officer or one judge. It was about the systemic racism that ran deep within the institution of law enforcement, and it was about time someone called it out. As Melanie drove home, her mind worked through the strategy she would need to employ. She had already reported the officer's actions to the DOJ's Civil Rights Division, but now she had to ensure that her complaint was taken seriously. She had to make sure that the officer's actions didn't get swept under the rug, as so many cases before him had been. But that would only be the beginning. The judge, too, would need to be investigated. His actions in the courtroom were far from an isolated incident. They were part of a larger pattern of bias that she had seen time and time again throughout her career. She had the power to ensure that his actions didn't go unnoticed, and she intended to use that power to its fullest. The following days were a blur. Melanie found herself juggling multiple cases, all of them more pressing than the last. But through it all, the case from that fateful day in court lingered in her mind, demanding her attention. The report she had filed with the DOJ was gathering traction, and her complaint had been taken up by the Civil Rights Division. It was rare for an officer to face discipline over a traffic stop, but Melanie wasn't going to let that be the end of it. She had vowed to see this through, no matter the cost. And then came the moment she had been waiting for, the follow-up hearing. It was scheduled 2 weeks later, and by then, the story of what had happened in that courtroom had made its way through the legal circles. Word had spread quickly, and Melanie's name had become synonymous with the fight for justice in that courthouse. She had become a symbol for all those who had been dismissed, ignored, and dehumanized by a system that was supposed to protect them. The hearing would not only be about her ticket, but about holding the judge and the officer accountable for their actions. As Melanie entered the courtroom once again, she felt the weight of the eyes upon her. This time, however, the atmosphere was different. There was a palpable sense of anticipation, as if the people in the room knew that this wasn't just about the ticket anymore. It was about something much larger than that. As she made her way to the stand, the murmurs of the gallery quieted, and even the bailiff seemed to stand a little straighter. Judge Wills, who had once held so much power in this room, now looked weary. His eyes were no longer filled with the arrogance that had defined him the first time Melanie had stood before him. He had learned, the hard way, that not everyone could be dismissed so easily. Not everyone could be silenced with a simple look or a few condescending words. And that, in itself, was a victory. But Melanie wasn't interested in victories for herself. She was here to make sure that the system was held accountable. She wasn't just fighting for her own dignity. She was fighting for everyone who had been failed by the very people who were supposed to protect them. And she wouldn't stop until the truth had been fully unmasked. A courtroom shaken. The courthouse was packed. The hearing had generated more attention than anyone could have anticipated, especially after the initial shockwaves of Melanie's revelation. What was once a routine traffic violation case had morphed into a symbol of the fight against institutionalized racism, and now it was time to face the consequences head-on. Melanie walked into the courtroom that morning with a quiet determination. The floor beneath her feet felt solid, her heels clicking in rhythm as she moved toward her designated seat. The gallery was filled with reporters, activists, and a few curious spectators who had heard of the case from word of mouth. As she made her way to the front, Melanie could feel the weight of every eye in the room. Some looked at her with admiration, others with skepticism, but she couldn't afford to care. She was here for one reason, justice. Judge Clarence Wills, the man whose bias had nearly derailed her case, sat at the bench. His usual stern demeanor was nowhere to be found, instead, he looked almost defeated. The power he once held over the room seemed to have evaporated the moment he had learned who Melanie really was. She noticed his hands trembled ever so slightly as he adjusted his glasses, a stark contrast to the confident posture he had maintained in their first encounter. As the proceedings began, the room fell silent. The air was thick with tension. Melanie sat at the prosecutor's table, her heart steady, as she prepared to present her case once again. But this time, she wasn't just there to argue about a ticket. This time, the stakes were higher. The defense attorney representing the officer who had issued the ticket stood first. He was a seasoned lawyer, with years of experience defending law enforcement officers accused of misconduct. His reputation for being ruthless in court was well known, and he wasted no time in attacking Melanie's credibility. He referred to her as an ambitious government employee, who was merely trying to make a name for herself at the expense of a hard-working officer. He tried to discredit the video footage she had submitted, suggesting it was taken out of context and didn't accurately represent the events of the traffic stop. But Melanie was prepared. She knew how these defense attorneys operated, always shifting the narrative to suit their needs. Her eyes remained focused, calm as she listened to the lawyer's theatrics. When it was her turn to speak, she rose from her chair with quiet confidence. Her voice, though measured, carried weight as she addressed the court. "Your Honor, I'm not here to attack an officer simply because of his profession," Melanie began. "I'm here because the actions of this officer were not just a violation of my rights, they were a symptom of a much larger problem. A system that allows unchecked bias and discriminatory practices to dictate the way people of color are treated by law enforcement." A murmur spread through the gallery, but Melanie didn't flinch. She had said what she came to say. She continued, "This case is not just about me or about one officer's actions. It's about every person who has been profiled, every person who has been unfairly treated by law enforcement simply because of the color of their skin. And I refuse to let it be brushed aside as just another traffic violation. Melanie turned to face Judge Wills, who was now shifting uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding eye contact. His face was red, his jaw clenched tightly. For the first time since she'd walked into the courtroom, Melanie could see the fear in his eyes. He knew what was coming. And this time, there would be no avoiding the truth. "I know this isn't easy, Judge Wills," she said, her tone unwavering. "It's easier to pretend that the system works the way it's supposed to. It's easier to act as if the biases we see in this courtroom are anomalies. But they're not. And today, it's your turn to answer for those biases. The same biases that allowed an officer to stop me for no valid reason, the same biases that have permeated this courtroom for years." There was a sharp intake of breath from the gallery. Melanie's words were cutting through the room, and she could see the judge's composure cracking. He opened his mouth to respond, but Melanie was quick to cut him off. "Before you say anything, Judge," she said, her voice firm, "let me remind you of the power you hold in this courtroom. You are not just here to enforce the law, you are here to ensure that the law is applied equally. And yet, you allowed yourself to make assumptions based on my appearance rather than the facts before you. You treated me as less than because of my skin color, and you did so without a second thought." Judge Wills clenched his fists, clearly agitated, but Melanie didn't back down. She pressed on. "I'm not just asking for an apology, Your Honor. I'm asking for accountability. I'm asking for a review of your actions in this case, and in every case where you've allowed your bias to cloud your judgment." The room was dead silent. Everyone was waiting for Judge Wills to respond, but instead, he remained mute. It was clear he was struggling to regain his composure. The realization of his own wrongdoing seemed to have paralyzed him. But Melanie wasn't about to give him a free pass. "You may think that your actions were inconsequential, that this is just one small case in a long career. But I assure you, this is bigger than me. This is about the trust the public places in this court, and in you, to make fair and impartial decisions. Your actions undermine that trust, Your Honor. And that is not something I can simply let go." As Melanie finished speaking, the judge finally looked up at her, his expression a mix of anger and embarrassment. But it was too late. The damage had already been done. Everyone in the room, from the gallery to the defense attorney, had witnessed the truth. The judge's bias was no longer something that could be swept under the rug. It had been laid bare for all to see. A long pause followed. Melanie stood tall, unwavering, as she awaited the judge's response. She had already made her case. Now it was his turn to answer for the harm he had caused. Finally, Judge Wills cleared his throat, his voice strained. I will review the actions taken in this case," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "And I will ensure that this matter is addressed thoroughly." Melanie's eyes narrowed, but she didn't allow herself to show any emotion. The statement, while significant, wasn't enough. It was a start, but there was still much work to be done. "I'll be expecting more than just a review, Judge," Melanie replied, her voice cutting through the tension. "I'll be expecting concrete action. Because that's what this case deserves. And I won't let it end here." With those words, Melanie turned and walked out of the courtroom, her head held high. As she exited the building, the weight of what had transpired began to sink in. The battle was far from over. There were still many hurdles ahead: her work at the Department of Justice, the ongoing investigation into the officer's conduct, the public scrutiny that would follow, but for the first time, Melanie felt hopeful. She had challenged the system. She had stood her ground against those who sought to dismiss her, to silence her. And in doing so, she had sent a message to everyone who had been subjected to the same biases and discrimination: change was coming. And it would not be stopped. As she drove home, Melanie took a deep breath. She knew that this was just the beginning of a much larger fight. But now, more than ever, she was ready for it. The truth had been revealed. And now, there would be no turning back. The ripple effects of truth. The days following the courtroom confrontation were a whirlwind for Melanie Carter. What had started as a simple traffic violation case had evolved into a turning point in her career, her life, and, quite possibly, in the judicial system itself. As the media coverage of the hearing spread, so did the calls for reform within the judicial system. Melanie had ignited a spark, and now it was burning brightly, challenging the status quo in ways that no one could have predicted. At the Department of Justice, where she had worked for over a decade as a federal prosecutor, Melanie's phone didn't stop ringing. Fellow attorneys, civil rights organizations, and even some political figures reached out to congratulate her for standing up to a system that had, for too long, been built on unequal treatment. Her case had become the embodiment of what many had been fighting for: a call for systemic change. But with the praise came the inevitable backlash. Melanie knew she wasn't naive enough to believe that the powers that be would quietly accept the public scrutiny. The conversations were happening behind closed doors, in boardrooms and courtrooms alike. She could feel the whispers of those who would do anything to discredit her and silence the movement she had started. One afternoon, as she sat at her desk, reviewing legal briefs, her supervisor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Neil Patterson, walked into her office. His usually calm demeanor was replaced by something more serious. He didn't need to speak for Melanie to sense the tension in the air. "Melanie, you've stirred up quite a storm with your case," Neil began, his voice low and measured. He closed the door behind him and sat down across from her. Melanie leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled before her. "I'm aware. But what's done is done. The truth is out there now, and there's no going back." Neil studied her for a moment, his gaze intense. "I don't think you understand the full scope of what you've just done. You've shaken the foundation of the entire judicial system. And now, there are people who want you to pay the price for that." Melanie didn't flinch. She knew the risks, but they didn't deter her. "I'm not backing down, Neil. Not now. Not after what I've seen." He nodded slowly, understanding her resolve. "I'm not saying you should back down. I'm just warning you. This isn't going to be easy. You've made powerful enemies, and they won't hesitate to use their influence to make your life difficult. They're already talking about transferring you out of your current position." Melanie's heart sank for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. She had known that the road ahead would be tough, but she had never anticipated that her actions would make her a target in such a personal way. But it was a price she was willing to pay. She wasn't going to let fear stop her. "I'm not going anywhere," she said firmly. "If they think they can intimidate me, they've got another thing coming. I've spent my whole career standing up for what's right. Just because I spoke the truth doesn't mean I'm suddenly going to back down when things get tough." Her words resonated with Neil, and he regarded her with a mixture of respect and concern. "I get it. But you should know, Melanie, that you've set a precedent. This is bigger than just you and me. This is about something much larger. You've become a symbol. Melanie sat in silence for a moment, letting his words sink in. The weight of what she had done hit her in that quiet instant. She hadn't just stood up for herself. She had stood up for the countless people who had been silenced, ignored, or treated unfairly because of the biases in the system. She had given them a voice, even if it meant risking everything she had worked for. "Look," Neil said, breaking the silence. "There's something I need to tell you. The DOJ is preparing to launch an internal investigation into the judge's behavior, specifically in the cases where he has demonstrated bias. We've had some whispers about his rulings, and it seems like it's time to take a closer look. They want you to be involved." Melanie's eyebrows lifted in surprise. "Involved in what way?" "Well, we need someone who can speak to the bigger picture," Neil explained. "Someone who understands the systemic issues at play, not just in this case, but across the board. They want you to help oversee the review process." The offer was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it was a major step forward in the fight for justice and accountability. On the other hand, it would place her in an even more vulnerable position, putting her under even more scrutiny. But there was no turning back now. Melanie's path had been set, and she wasn't about to let fear dictate her choices. "I'll do it," she said decisively. "But I need to know that I have the full backing of the department. This needs to be more than just an investigation. It needs to be a movement." Neil nodded. "You've got it. I'll make sure they understand that. Just know this, there are going to be people trying to undermine you every step of the way. But I'm confident you'll be able to see this through." Meanwhile, Judge Wills had been placed under review, and his actions were being scrutinized. It wasn't just his behavior in Melanie's case that was under examination but his entire record. The more the DOJ dug, the more troubling his history became. It wasn't just Melanie's case that exposed his bias, it was a pattern of biased rulings, discriminatory behavior, and questionable ethics that had been overlooked for years. As the review process continued, Melanie found herself in a delicate position. She had to balance her work as a prosecutor with the pressure of being the public face of a movement that demanded change. Every decision she made, every case she worked on, was now scrutinized through a new lens. Her every move was under the microscope, and she knew that there were people waiting for her to slip up. But she wasn't going to let that stop her. One evening, as Melanie sat in her apartment, reading through case files and preparing for a long day ahead, she received an unexpected phone call. It was from her colleague, Mark Dawson, a fellow federal prosecutor who had been working with her on the Judge Wills investigation. "Melanie, we've got some news," Mark said, his voice low. "You're not going to believe this, but we've found something big, something that could change everything." Melanie's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" "Evidence of corruption," Mark continued. "It seems Judge Wills wasn't just biased in his rulings. He's been involved in a bribery scheme with several local law enforcement officers. We've got the evidence we need to bring him down. It's all here." The words hit Melanie like a freight train. She had suspected something more was at play, but to hear it confirmed was both a relief and a shock. This wasn't just about racial bias anymore. This was about a corrupt system that had been operating under everyone's noses for years. "Let's do this," Melanie said, her voice steady. "We take him down. But we do it right." The pieces were falling into place, and the battle for justice was entering its next phase. The ripple effects of Melanie's truth were only beginning. And this time, nothing and no one would stand in her way. The price of justice and the road ahead. As the days turned into weeks and the investigation into Judge Clarence Wills deepened, Melanie Carter felt a growing sense of urgency. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but with each revelation, the stakes became higher, the risks more daunting. This was no longer just about one judge's biased ruling, it was about dismantling a system that had allowed corruption, racial discrimination, and injustice to fester for far too long. And, as the federal prosecutor leading the charge, Melanie found herself at the center of it all. The media had begun covering the investigation extensively, and Melanie's name had become synonymous with a new wave of legal reform. She was invited to speak at panel discussions, interviewed by national outlets, and hailed as a hero by civil rights organizations. But it was a title she neither sought nor enjoyed. She wasn't interested in accolades. She was driven by something much more personal, a fierce sense of duty to her community, to her family, and to the countless people who had been wronged by a system that had failed them time and time again. Despite the public recognition, Melanie faced constant pressure from all sides. She knew that the higher the profile of the case, the more powerful the forces that would seek to derail it. But this time, she wasn't just fighting for herself or the people she represented, she was fighting for justice, for the future of a legal system that desperately needed to evolve. One morning, as Melanie walked into her office at the Department of Justice, she was greeted by an envelope marked confidential. The thick letterhead indicated it was from the DOJ's Office of Professional Responsibility. Melanie's stomach tightened. She had received her fair share of formal letters in her career, but none of them had ever felt quite like this one. Opening the envelope, she read the letter with a growing sense of dread. Dear Ms. Carter, we have been made aware of the ongoing investigation concerning Judge Clarence Wills and the allegations of corruption and misconduct that have been brought to light. As a result, we are conducting an internal review of the matter and request your full cooperation in providing any documents, evidence, or testimony you have related to this case. Your position as a federal prosecutor gives you a unique responsibility in this matter, and we expect your full compliance with the review process. Please be advised that this inquiry could extend to any other matters connected to this investigation. Sincerely. Office of Professional Responsibility. Melanie set the letter down slowly, her mind racing. She had anticipated some pushback. After all, Judge Wills had powerful allies, but this felt different. The language was pointed, almost accusatory. The mention of compliance struck her like a warning shot across the bow. She wasn't naive enough to think the system would let her take down one of its own without consequences. But now it seemed that the DOJ itself was under scrutiny, questioning her methods and her motives. Her phone buzzed, breaking her from her thoughts. It was Neil Patterson, her supervisor, and one of the few people in the department she could fully trust. Melanie, we need to talk. I just got word about the letter. They're pushing for a full review of your actions. We knew this was coming, Neil said, his tone serious but not panicked. I knew they wouldn't let me go that easily, Melanie replied, her voice calm despite the rising storm inside her. But I'm not backing down. Neil paused. I don't doubt that. But this isn't just about you anymore. This is bigger than any of us. The case against Wills is one thing, but now the internal review has put a target on your back. People are starting to ask questions, about your motivations, your connections, everything. It's getting complicated. Melanie leaned back in her chair, taking a deep breath. She had never shied away from difficult situations, but this was new territory. Her actions had made her a lightning rod, and now, the very institution she had worked so hard to serve was questioning her integrity. She felt as though she were standing at a precipice, with the weight of everything she had fought for hanging in the balance. I didn't do this for glory, Neil, Melanie said quietly. I did it because it's the right thing to do. If we don't hold people accountable, if we don't make them face the truth, then what's the point of all of this? What's the point of fighting for justice if we let corruption win? Neil's voice softened. I know, Melanie. But we need to be careful. There are forces at play here that we can't always control. The investigation into Wills is just the beginning. If they succeed in discrediting you, the entire case could fall apart. You've made powerful enemies, and they won't hesitate to destroy you if it means protecting their own. For a moment, Melanie felt the weight of his words pressing down on her. The road ahead would be perilous, filled with challenges she had never imagined. But she wasn't about to back down now. She had come too far, and the stakes were too high. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice firm. "We'll fight this together. Whatever comes, we stand for what's right. And if that means facing down the people who have tried to silence us, then so be it." As the days wore on, the pressure only intensified. The media, which had once hailed her as a hero, began to turn. The stories shifted from praise to skepticism, questioning her motivations, her connections, and the methods she had used to uncover the corruption in Judge Will's court. Social media erupted with divisive commentary, with some labeling her a whistleblower and others accusing her of overreaching. The world was watching, and every move she made felt like it was being scrutinized under a magnifying glass. Behind closed doors, Melanie continued to work tirelessly on the investigation. The evidence she had gathered was undeniable. Judge Wills had been involved in a bribery scheme, using his position to leverage power for personal gain. But the deeper they dug, the more they uncovered. It wasn't just Judge Wills. There were other judges, other law enforcement officials, who had participated in the same system of corruption. This was no isolated case, it was a network of power and privilege that spanned far beyond one man's actions. With each new revelation, the case against Wills grew stronger. And yet, Melanie knew that the true challenge was not in gathering evidence, it was in ensuring that the system would hold those responsible accountable. One afternoon, as she sat with her team of investigators, going over the latest findings, the phone rang. It was the one call Melanie had been waiting for, and it carried with it the weight of the entire case. "Melanie," Neil's voice came through, "we've got the green light. The DOJ has officially authorized the charges. Judge Wills will be arrested tomorrow." For the first time in weeks, Melanie allowed herself a moment to breathe. She had won, at least for now. The corrupt judge would face justice, and the system would have to reckon with the consequences of its inaction. But even in that small victory, Melanie knew the fight was far from over. This was just the beginning. The road to reform would be long and difficult, but she had started a movement, one that would not be easily extinguished. And as the news of Judge Will's arrest broke, Melanie Carter knew that her work had only just begun. In the weeks and months that followed, Melanie continued to push for reform, using her newfound platform to advocate for systemic change within the judicial system. Her voice became one of the most prominent in the fight for racial equality and justice reform, and while the battles were far from over, the victories began to accumulate. More officers were investigated for misconduct. More judges faced scrutiny for their biased rulings. And more people began to understand that the fight for justice was not just a matter of one case, it was a matter of dismantling a system that had failed too many for far too long. For Melanie Carter, the journey had been harrowing, filled with trials and obstacles. But as she looked at the impact of her work, she couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of pride. She had done what she set out to do, not just for herself, but for the countless others who had been silenced, ignored, or mistreated by a system that had long prioritized power over fairness. And in that quiet victory, Melanie knew she had taken a crucial step toward creating a world where justice could no longer be denied.